Being a tribal hunter wasn't about weekend camping trips or shooting deer from tree stands. It was about tracking apex predators with stone-tipped spears, surviving months in hostile wilderness, where one missed throw meant your family starved while you became dinner. The question isn't whether it was brutal, it's whether you'd survive the first week. Becoming a tribal hunter started before you could walk properly. Children were selected as young as 5 or 6. Not through gentle aptitude tests, but through brutal evaluations that would make modern parents call social services tribal elders examine physical traits like lung capacity, hand-eye coordination, and pain tolerance alongside family lineage, because hunting skills often ran in bloodlines. The early conditioning was designed to break weak children before they became liabilities. Pain tolerance tests included walking barefoot across thorns, holding burning coals, and enduring deliberate cuts without crying. Failure meant immediate elimination from hunter training. Success meant years of escalating torment. These children learned to read animal tracks before they learned to speak properly if their tribe even had written language. They could identify whether a deer was injured pregnant or being stalked by predators just from hoof impressions while other children played games. Future hunters practiced moving without sound for hours, learning to control their breathing, heartbeat, and even bladder function, because one wrong noise meant death. Training accidents were frequent and accepted as natural selection. Broken bones from tree climbing, drowning during water trials, and poisoning from plant identification mistakes claimed roughly 1 in 4 trainees. Tribal cultures varied in their specific methods, but none were gentle. The Inuit tested children against Arctic conditions while Amazon tribes used venomous insects, and African tribes employed predator encounters. Gender roles added another layer of complexity. Most tribes trained boys as hunters, but some cultures included girls, while others assigned completely different survival roles, regardless of gender. Those selected faced the same brutal standards because nature didn't care about cultural preferences, only survival capability. But learning to endure pain was just the foundation. Young hunters had to develop tracking skills that would make modern forensic investigators seem like amateurs. A single footprint could tell an experienced hunter whether an animal was limping from injury pregnant, with young, or being pursued by predators. The depth revealed weight distribution, while the spacing between steps indicated emotional state. Fear created longer strides, while contentment produced leisurely spacing. Hunters learned to read these stories, written in mud and dust, with the precision of detectives examining crime scenes. Beyond footprints, hunters interpreted an entire ecosystem of signs. Fresh scat revealed diet and health, while territorial markings indicated which predators controlled specific areas. Broken twigs showed passage direction, while disturbed earth marked feeding or resting spots. Scent trails invisible to modern humans. Guided hunters across miles of terrain, because their noses were trained from childhood to detect variations in animal musk, fear pheromones, and blood. Tribal hunters memorized thousands of square miles with photographic precision. They knew every water source, seasonal fruit tree, and animal crossing point, because maps didn't exist, and getting lost meant death elders taught memory techniques using stories, songs, and physical landmarks that embedded geographical knowledge so deeply it became instinctual, when your family's survival depended on it. What about fresh bear scat versus 3-day-old deposits? Misreading these signs led directly to ambushes, starvation, or walking into territorial disputes with apex predators. All this knowledge meant nothing without the weapons to act on it, and mastering tribal hunting weapons required skills that would break modern athletes. Creating weapons from raw materials required mastery of multiple disciplines that would challenge modern specialists. Stone knapping for spear and arrowheads alone took years to learn, because one poorly placed strike could shatter hours of work, leaving hunters defenseless. When they needed weapons, most of the technique demanded understanding rock geology stress patterns and precise force application that few people today could replicate. Hunters spent 4 to 6 hours daily practicing with their weapons, because missing a vital shot meant watching your family starve. While predators circled closer, a competent spear thrower could hit a moving target at 30 yards, while bow hunters achieved accuracy at over 100 yards, with arrows they crafted by hand using bird feathers, sinew and wooden shafts straightened over controlled fires. Different prey demanded specialised weapons. Small game required light arrows with sharp points, while large mammals needed heavy spears with broad heads. Designed to cause massive bleeding rabbit snares, used different construction than pitfall traps for bears. And each weapon required specific maintenance techniques to prevent failure at critical moments. During hunts meant immediate death, because backup weapons were heavy luxuries most hunters couldn't afford to carry. But even perfect weapons were useless if your body couldn't handle the physical demands that would reshape your skeleton and test every limit. Persistence hunting demanded cardiovascular conditioning that would destroy modern marathon runners. Tribal hunters routinely chased animals for 8 to 12 hours, maintaining steady pursuit until their prey collapsed from exhaustion. This technique required running 20 to 30 miles across rough terrain while carrying weapons and maintaining focus, because losing sight of wounded prey meant starting over with nothing. Deliberate body modifications enhanced hunting capabilities beyond natural limits. Many tribes stretched earlobes with progressively larger objects, creating acoustic funnels that improved directional hearing. Some cultures filed teeth into sharp points for emergency meat processing, while others pierced nasal septums to enhance smell sensitivity. These weren't cosmetic choices, but functional adaptations for survival. Temperature conditioning started in childhood with exposure to extreme heat and cold. Without protective clothing, hunters learned to function in freezing water, hunt during blizzards and track prey across desert conditions, because seasons didn't pause for human comfort. Their bodies adapted by developing increased blood circulation, enhanced fat distribution, and improved thermal regulation that kept them alive when others died. Skeletal evidence from hunter remains shows dramatic bone changes, repetitive spear throwing in large specific muscle attachment points. While bow use created asymmetrical arm development, constant running modified leg bones and foot structure, while carrying heavy loads compressed spinal vertebrae. These weren't temporary changes, but permanent skeletal adaptations that marked hunters for life. Some tribes deliberately exposed young hunters to small doses of plant and animal toxins, building immunity to substances they might encounter during hunts or use on their weapons. This controlled poisoning killed many trainees, but survivors gained resistance that could save their lives when handling venomous prey or toxic plants. These physical preparations were essential because the territories hunters entered were designed by nature to kill anything that didn't belong. Every square mile of hunting territory contained multiple ways to die quickly. Predator markings warned of territorial boundaries that meant instant death for trespassers. Cave bear claw marks on trees indicated feeding areas, while big cat scent posts marked hunting grounds. Crossing these invisible lines triggered aggressive responses from animals that could crush human skulls with single bites. Environmental hazards changed with seasons, making safe paths. Deadly traps, spring flooding, turned familiar stream crossings into torrents, while winter avalanche zones shifted based on snowpack and wind patterns. Hunters memorized hundreds of alternate routes because what worked in summer became suicide. In winter, poisonous plants grew in patches that looked identical to edible varieties, and one mistake meant agonizing death within hours. Navigation required reading natural signs that GPS couldn't replicate. Star positions indicated direction, while prevailing wind patterns revealed location. But cloud cover or storms eliminated these references, forcing hunters to rely on subtle terrain features like water flow patterns, rock formations, and vegetation changes. Getting lost meant wandering until dehydration exposure or predators finished the job. Competing tribes added human dangers to natural ones. Territorial disputes erupted over prime hunting grounds, water sources, and seasonal migration routes. Tribal boundaries shifted constantly based on military strength, population changes, and resource availability. Trespassing hunters faced capture, torture, or immediate execution, depending on tribal customs and current political tensions. Successful hunters developed mental maps covering thousands of square miles with detailed knowledge of seasonal changes, predator territories, and safe passage routes. They knew which valleys flooded, which ridges offered shelter, and which areas became death traps during specific weather conditions. This geographical knowledge passed down through generations because written maps didn't exist. The landscape itself was trying to kill you, but that was nothing compared to the creatures you were actively trying to hunt. Calling them prey animals was almost insulting to the creatures that regularly turned hunters into victim mammoths, stood 12 feet tall, weighing 8 tons with tusks that could impale multiple humans. A mammoth with spear wounds would charge blindly, trampling everything in its path, while injured cave bears fought with desperate fury that multiplied their natural strength. Large cats, when cornered, would attack anything moving, including other predators, making retreat impossible once blood was drawn. Group hunting required coordination that would challenge modern military units. 20 hunters had to surround a mammoth while maintaining escape routes, communicating through hand signals and timing spear throws within seconds of each other. Individual hunting was suicide against megafauna, but common for smaller dangerous prey, like wild boar or wolves. Even these supposedly manageable targets killed experienced hunters. Regularly, wild boar could disembowel humans with single tusk strikes, while wolves hunted in coordinated packs that surrounded and overwhelmed isolated hunters. Success rates were brutally low. Mammoth hunts succeeded perhaps 1 in 10 attempts with average casualties of 2 to 3 hunters per successful kill. Cave bear hunting claimed even more lives while providing less meat, making it a prestige activity rather than practical sustenance. Small prey like deer, rabbits and birds offered better survival odds, but brought little social status. Hunters would select a target, then maintain pursuit for hours or even days, never allowing the prey to rest properly. Humans could regulate body temperature through sweating, while most mammals overheated quickly, making this a battle of biological efficiency rather than speed or strength. Ambush strategies required reading terrain like tactical manuals. Hunters identified natural choke points, animal trails and water sources, then constructed elaborate trap systems. Pitfall traps for large game involved digging pits 8 feet deep, lined with sharpened stakes, and camouflage with branches. Smaller snares used twisted sinew triggered by animal movement, bird calls and ground vibrations to coordinate attacks across miles of terrain. Each hunter knew their exact roll timing and escape route because verbal communication would alert prey to danger. One hunter would drive animals toward ambush points while others waited in predetermined positions. Seasonal strategies adapted to animal behavior patterns. Winter hunts targeted weakened prey near water sources, while spring focused on animals, heavy with young summer hunts, exploited territorial disputes during mating season, and autumn targeted animals fattening for winter. They reverted to direct attack, and when coordination broke down, individual hunters scattered to avoid being trampled or mauled. Failed hunts meant injured teammates, wounded dangerous animals, and wasted time that tribes couldn't afford. Even successful hunts were just the beginning, surviving in the wilderness. While running streams might be contaminated upstream by rotting carcasses, hunters learned to identify safe water sources by observing animal behavior and testing taste. But when clean water wasn't available, they purified it by boiling in animal stomach pouches or filtering through sand and charcoal layers. They dug snow caves lined with fur, while desert hunters created shade structures that channeled cooling breezes. Proper insulation meant survival, while poor construction meant freezing or overheating to death. Fire-making in adverse conditions separated living hunters from dead ones. Wet wood required specific techniques like finding dry tinder inside rotting logs or using birch bark that burned even when soaked hunters carried fire, starting materials in waterproof containers made from animal bladders, because losing the ability to make fire meant certain death in cold climates. Foraging demanded encyclopedic knowledge of edible versus poisonous plants, insects and small creatures. Hunters knew which berries were safe, which roots provided nutrition, and which grubs offered protein. But mistakes were fatal. Some plants looked identical to edible varieties, while containing toxins that caused painful deaths. Nocturnal survival required different skills. Entirely, hunters slept in elevated positions or against large rocks to prevent surprise attacks. They learned to identify predator sounds, movement patterns, and territorial boundaries because many dangerous animals hunted primarily at night. But even masters of wilderness survival faced an enemy that no skill could fully defeat: the constant spectre of starvation. Starvation was the invisible hunter that stalked every tribe, because successful hunts were far from guaranteed. Large game hunts failed roughly 7 times out of 10 attempts, while smaller prey often disappeared due to seasonal migrations, weather patterns, or competing predators. After 3 days without food, metabolism slowed dramatically to conserve energy. After a week, muscle tissue began breaking down to fuel vital organs. Hunters operating on empty stomachs experienced blurred vision, trembling hands, and impaired judgment, exactly when they needed peak performance most yet. Somehow, they continued tracking prey across miles of terrain. Food preservation became critical survival knowledge. Tribes developed techniques for smoking meat into jerky that lasted months, while fat could be rendered and stored in animal bladders. Dried fish and pemmican mixtures of meat fat and berries provided concentrated nutrition during lean periods. Cannibalism occurred more frequently than historical records suggest, usually starting with recently deceased tribal members before progressing to deliberate killing. During the worst famines, children, elderly, and weak members were sacrificed to preserve hunters who might secure future food. Competition within tribes intensified as resources dwindled. Successful hunters gained status and better food shares, while failed hunters faced exile or death. Tribal hierarchies shifted rapidly based on who could provide sustenance, and traditional social bonds dissolved when survival was at stake. Hunger made everyone desperate, and desperation led to conflicts that tore tribes apart from within. Tribal politics turned hunting success into a deadly competition where your kill count determined whether you lived as a leader or died as an outcast. The most successful hunters claimed first choice of food mates and territory, while failed hunters faced exile or execution because tribes couldn't afford to feed unproductive members. This hierarchy shifted constantly based on recent performance, making every hunt a political statement. Territorial disputes erupted when prime hunting grounds overlapped between groups, or individual hunters claimed exclusive rights to productive areas. These conflicts were resolved through combat trials or hunting competition where losers faced banishment from the territory. Tribal councils consisted entirely of proven hunters because only those who fed the tribe earned the right to make decisions affecting survival. Food distribution followed strict hierarchies that reinforced hunter status. Successful hunters received the choicest cuts while their families ate. Well-failed hunters got scraps or nothing. Depending on tribal generosity, this system created powerful incentives for hunting success, but also bred resentment and internal conflict when resources grew scarce. Punishment for hunting failures or violations was swift and brutal. Hunters who lost weapons through carelessness faced beatings or finger amputation, while those who violated hunting taboos might be exiled during winter months essentially. Death sentences delivered through social rejection. Some tribes practiced ritual scarring or maiming to mark poor hunters as warnings to others. Marriage prospects depended entirely on hunting ability. No family would offer daughters to hunters who couldn't provide food, while successful hunters could claim multiple wives and pass their skills to more offspring. This created genetic selection pressure that favoured hunting traits over generations. Intertribal warfare over resources claimed more hunter lives than actual hunting expeditions. Competing tribes fought viciously over seasonal migration routes, water sources and territory boundaries, with casualties that weakened both groups. Hunters developed specialised techniques for Arctic survival, including building insulated shelters from blocks of snow and ice while wearing layered clothing made from multiple animal hides with fur facing both inward and outward for maximum warmth. Following animal migrations required tribes to move hundreds of miles across dangerous terrain, carrying everything needed for survival. Entire communities tracked caribou herds, mammoth movements, and seasonal bird patterns because staying stationary meant starvation. When prey animals moved to better feeding grounds, migration logistics involved coordinating group movement with weather patterns, territorial boundaries, and resource availability along the route. Seasonal resource availability created feast or famine cycles that tested tribal endurance. Autumn demanded intensive food preservation before winter, while winter itself offered little beyond what had been stored or could be hunted from desperate starving animals. Weather prediction meant life or death. For travelling hunters, sudden storms could trap groups for days, while unexpected temperature drops killed inadequately prepared individuals. Hunters read cloud formations, wind patterns and animal behaviour to predict weather changes hours or days in advance. While summer required lighter clothing, water containers and different hunting implements, each seasonal transition demanded complete equipment overhauls that tribes couldn't always afford. Surviving the seasons was hard enough, but when injuries occurred in the wilderness, primitive medicine often proved more dangerous than the wounds themselves. Primitive medical treatment often accelerated death rather than preventing it, because tribal healers worked with contaminated tools, limited knowledge and desperation that led to dangerous interventions. Hunting injuries ranged from simple cuts to catastrophic wounds that exposed internal organs. Mammoth tusks could puncture lungs, while bear claws opened arteries that bled out within minutes. Big cat attacks typically targeted the neck and spine, causing instant paralysis or death. Surgical techniques relied on obsidian blades, bone needles and fire for cauterization. Some herbal medicines actually worked. Willow bark reduced pain and inflammation, while certain fungi had antibiotic properties that prevented wound infection. Honey applied to cuts provided natural antiseptic effects, and specific plant poultices could stop bleeding. However, many traditional remedies were completely ineffective or actively harmful, including animal dung applications that introduced deadly bacteria. Infection rates approached 90% for serious wounds because sterilisation concepts didn't exist. Contaminated tools, dirty hands and environmental exposure turned minor injuries into fatal complications. Tribal members watched wounds fester, turn black and smell of death, while healers tried increasingly desperate treatments that hastened the inevitable. Tribal decisions about medical care were brutally practical. Hunters with severe injuries that prevented future hunting were often abandoned to die, rather than burden the group with non-productive members. Only valuable hunters, or those with essential skills, received intensive treatment that consumed precious resources and medicine. Spiritual obligations controlled every aspect of hunting, from weapon preparation to animal disposal, because tribes believed that violating supernatural laws brought disaster, starvation and death to entire communities. Pre-hunt rituals required hunters to purify themselves through fasting sweat lodge ceremonies and specific prayers that could take days to complete. Many cultures forbade hunting pregnant animals during specific seasons, while others banned killing certain species considered sacred or spiritually powerful hunters couldn't use specific weapons on particular animals, couldn't hunt alone during certain moon phases, and couldn't consume their own kills until shamanic approval was granted. Shamans controlled hunting success through spiritual interventions, blessing weapons, predicting favourable hunting times, and communicating with animal spirits. Hunters brought offerings to shamans before major expeditions, while failed hunts required spiritual consultations to determine what supernatural laws had been violated. Shamanic pronouncements could ban hunters from specific activities or territories, effectively ending their careers. Violating spiritual laws resulted in banishment, exile, or execution because tribes couldn't risk supernatural retribution that might destroy everyone. All these spiritual obligations reinforced the rigid social hierarchy that determined whether a hunter lived as a hero or died as an outcast. Hunter rankings created a brutal caste system where your latest kill determined everything from where you slept to whether you lived through winter. The most successful hunters occupied positions just below tribal chiefs, while failed hunters ranked barely above slaves or captives. This hierarchy wasn't based on birthright or tradition, but purely on your ability to bring back meat, and your status could plummet overnight with a single missed spear throw. Effectively ending their genetic lineage, arranged marriages were negotiations between families where hunting records served as dowry and proof of worthiness. Teaching responsibilities fell to accomplished hunters who passed knowledge to the next generation. But this wasn't altruistic mentoring. Experienced hunters jealously guarded their best techniques, sharing only enough information to maintain tribal survival while keeping superior methods secret to preserve their competitive advantage. Knowledge transfer occurred through apprenticeships, where young hunters served successful masters for years before gaining independence. Elder status offered temporary refuge for aging hunters whose accumulated wisdom earned respect even as their physical abilities declined. But this protection was conditional and temporary, based on whether their knowledge continued providing value to younger hunters. Hunters who lost status due to injury, age, or repeated failures found themselves excluded from group hunts, denied choice food portions, and eventually ostracized. Completely tribal communities had no social safety nets for former hunters who couldn't adapt to alternative roles. But even the most successful hunters eventually faced the inevitable decline that would strip away everything they'd worked to achieve. Physical decline hit hunters hard and fast because their bodies had endured decades of extreme stress. By age 30, most hunters showed significant deterioration in vision reflexes and joint mobility, while old injuries created permanent disabilities that ended hunting careers. Alternative roles existed for some aging hunters who could transition to weapon crafting, trap construction, or training young apprentices. But these positions were limited, and tribes couldn't support many non-productive members. Former hunters might become tool makers, spiritual advisors, or scouts, but only if their accumulated knowledge provided enough value to justify feeding them. Respected elders received care and attention for their wisdom and experience. But when food became scarce, aging hunters faced abandonment or expected suicide to preserve resources for younger, more productive members. Some tribes practiced ritualized killing of elderly members, while others simply left them behind during migrations. Knowledge preservation occurred primarily through storytelling, where aging hunters passed down tracking techniques, weapon crafting methods, and territorial information to younger generations. Death came early for most hunters, with average lifespans rarely exceeding 40 years, due to accumulated injuries, chronic pain, and physical breakdown. Body disposal followed tribal customs ranging from burial to exposure for scavengers, depending on available resources and spiritual beliefs. Many veteran hunters simply disappeared during hunts, never returning to burden their tribes with the cost of caring for them. So do you still think you could handle life as a tribal hunter, when every day meant choosing between death by starvation, death by predators, or death by the elements?